This is the
Five Stars
podcast.
Let me talk to you.
Hi.
So, what do you guys want to talk about? Tell me when I'm telling lies.
Thanks, guys. Back to you.
Well, we're back for a Monday show. And I know that came off as very unenthusiastic. My apologies. It's still kind of early in the morning. You can always tell what time of the day it is I'm recording. I either sound like Brad Garrett or whatever the equivalent is to my regular voice after it's warmed up for a while. The deeper voice makes me sound more manly, but I don't always get the opportunities to record first thing in the morning. I need my coffee first before I even think about sitting down to talk into a microphone. But today's a fairly packed podcast. We're going to be taking a look at WWF In Your House, the one that aired right before WrestleMania 12. And then we'll also review the following night's Retro Raw. So before we get into the logistics and talk about both shows, make sure you all subscribe to the 5 Starr Wrestling Report channel if you have not already. We are here on YouTube and Rumble on Mondays and Fridays for new shows and new wrestling discussions. As I always say, we are the wrestling channel nobody knows but everybody needs. And I'll tell you what I needed after watching these WWF shows over the weekend. It was an Advil and a Maker's Mark on the rocks. But since I don't drink, I ended up settling on a giant glass of water. And since I also didn't have any Advil on hand, I just kind of suffered through the migraine. So it sounds like we're in for a fun discussion on today's show, right? Well, let's get going with things and see how much I'm exaggerating. Because you all know how much I love to embellish things for the sake of piss-poor comedy. And let's go back in the time machine briefly here. A trip down memory lane. It was February of 2023. A rare Friday podcast at the time where, ironically enough, I think both WCW and World Class did not air TV episodes that week. And at the time, I was still reviewing AEW Dynamite. So as a means of torturing myself, because I hadn't already suffered through enough with experiencing 2 hours of rotten Dynamite programming, I said to myself, I can't leave the people hanging. I've got to review something else to make this show complete. So I did a rabbit hole deep dive. I searched out some wrestling shows that had taken place on that particular day in history, more specifically February 18th. And that was where I found WWF In Your House 6. Now, at the time, we were not doing the Retro Raw reviews, so it was just kind of a casual pay-per-view review on the channel. And now here we are a couple years later, and we're doing it again, baby. We have come full circle. Only this time we're going to do it with context. And we're going to see if my opinion changes on anything. Now, it has been a couple years since I watched the pay-per-view in its entirety. I never actually bothered to go back to listen to that show I did a couple years ago to get my overall thoughts. Frankly, I prefer not going back and rewatching a lot of my old content. It's just kind of how I'm wired. Those pre-workout days were rough. Me sounding like a freaking prepubescent teenager. So we're taking a look at this pay-per-view with fresh eyes. Or as the famous viral video goes, yes. If you know, you know. But it is time to review WWF In Your House 6. From the Louisville Gardens in Louisville, Kentucky. Jim Cornette's home turf. I'm sure he was just elated to be a part of this thing. Now for him, who cares how good or bad the show was? It was a short drive. And again, this is going to be our last stop before WrestleMania. Based on a lot of what went down on the card here, you could pretty much see everything being set in stone for where they wanted to go next month. I mean, they all but spoiled the main event cage match during the opening promotional video. Let's be honest, there wasn't a single person in the world that actually thought Diesel was walking out of that fucking cage with the WWF title. But let's go ahead and start from the top of the card and work our way down. We open the show with the Razor Ramon 1-2-3 Kid Crybaby match, where the loser would have to wear a giant baby diaper and have a milk bottle jammed down his throat. And I know the whole thing seems silly on its face, and I for one never waver from calling out stupid gimmick matches. But this is kind of an old school stipulation match where the idea is to humiliate the heel afterwards and give the people a good laugh. You would never want these matches to main event a card, but as an underneath or middle of the card bout with two guys that are well-established names, especially when you have a heel that the fans really loathe, you can do these kinds of matches and occasionally get away with it. I'm not going to sit here and say Sean Waltman had the same kind of nuclear heat that, say, a Jerry Lawler or a Jimmy Hart had from back in the day. But he was a Weasley enough heel to where you could get behind the idea of seeing Razor make him look like an ass. I mean, the guy was scrawny enough. It's still almost incredible to think that this feud's been going on and off for basically 3 years. Like going back to when the Kid debuted on Raw and then scored that upset win over Razor on television. And we finally reached the blow-off here in February of 1996. And boy, howdy, you could tell Razor was so fucking over it. Just counting the days left on his contract, brother. And it's not implying that he totally phoned it in for this match, because the wrestling was actually very good here. Razor and the Kid always worked well together. But you just think, from Razor's perspective, you start the new year off going from working with a flaming homosexual and losing the Intercontinental title at the same time. Then a month later, you're working the curtain jerk spot where the stipulation is whoever loses has to wear a baby diaper and then suck on a bottle. I mean, I'd be pretty complacent if I were Scott Hall. But like I said, the match was good. Probably wasn't the best performance we've seen in the feud. But hell, even a moderately average Razor versus Kid match is still leaps and bounds better than a lot of what we normally got with the WWF around this time. And looking back, there were a few moments that kind of took me out of it briefly. Like the spot where Ted DiBiase threw the powder in Razor's eyes right in front of the referee. And the match just kept going like nothing ever happened. And that was idiotic. There was also the very long, tedious sleeper hold sequence that went on for seemingly hours on end. And it was ridiculous because the Kids got Razor on the ground in this hold. Razor is clearly laying there unconscious, not moving a muscle. And they're laying there. They're laying there. They're laying there. And they're laying there. Like every so often, the ref would wiggle Razor's arm and be like, dude, you awake? And I'm like, can you just drop the fucking arm a few times to see if the guy isn't out cold? Common sense. But they picked it up toward the end after Razor started making the comeback. I will say, Sean Waltman always fed and bumped great for Razor's offense. Like some of those earlier spots where Razor was beeling him across the ring and then dumping him over the top rope to the floor. And Sean sold the hell out of that. Looked great. But we get the closing moments where Razor gives the kid a sack of shit slam off the middle rope. They do a distraction spot where Ted tries to avert Razor's attention so the kid can grab a handful of baby powder. But then Razor turns around and punts the powder back in his face. And then finally hits the kid with the Razor's edge. But he pulls his shoulders off the mat before 3 because, well, Razor's got a statement to make. All that grief and trouble the kids caused Razor over the last couple years, he was going to make sure he made an example out of him here. So he gives the kid a second Razor's edge, gets the pinfall, and you get the aftermath where Razor grabs the bottle and dumps what was basically just water in the kid's face. And then in very awkward fashion, he grabs the baby powder and then folds the kid over like he was about to penetrate his asshole. And then he wraps the diaper around the kid's dead body, narrowly avoiding touching his genitalia in the process. This is where I noted, it's a good thing these guys are close friends, because I was getting a little close for comfort there. And then, Razor dumped the baby powder on Sean's face for good measure. Again, silly, but not totally offensive. And as we've been talking about with the Retro Raws, the idea was to originally continue the beef with Razor and Goldust headed into WrestleMania, but then plans changed when Razor got busted with a drug charge, so they had to shift gears and go with Goldust and Piper instead. So even when you go back and analyze Razor's attitude after the fact here, you can still kind of tell he wasn't in the best of moods, knowing that Vince wanted him to keep feuding with Goldust. But it all worked out in the end, I guess. So we go from one dumpster fire to the next. And I'm not just using that analogy because the next match involved a garbage truck driver. So, well, first of all, let me ask a question. For the life of me, I can't remember if this was something I addressed when we reviewed the pay-per-view a couple years ago. 3 weeks ago on WWF Superstars, they shoot an angle where Hunter not only pedigree duked the dumpster on a trash can lid, but then afterwards, he cut his hair in the middle of the ring. Just out of the blue with no prior advertising. And I'm sitting there like, you dumb shits. Why would you just randomly cut Duke's hair as part of a heat angle and not try to use it as a stipulation match to sell tickets? You're telling me people wouldn't have bought tickets to potentially see Hunter get his head shaved? Morons. So yeah, Duke the Dumpster just shows up for an interview with Todd Pettingill moments before coming out to the ring, and he takes off his beanie to reveal a buzz cut. And as expected, he's fuming over the situation, talking about how it's revenge time and how he's going to beat Hunter's ass over what he did. I'm sitting there like, dude, it's hair. It'll grow back. But I was still pissed off because it was like, what a waste. What an absolute waste of a money match. Of all things to potentially make people actually give a crap about this dead-in-the-water feud. And they fucked it up. So naturally, Duke comes out with guns a-blazing, whipping Hunter from pillar to post, starting off the action hot. And I'm about to sit here and say, man, maybe this match is a lot better than I remember it being. And that train of thought lasted for all of about 90 seconds. Then they basically started having a back and forth where Hunter was carrying large portions of the offense. And that's where they proceeded to lose both me and the crowd. Now, let's be honest, nobody actually expected Duke to win this match. The least they could have done to make it interesting was have Hunter sell for 80% of it, and then do some kind of slip on a banana peel finish at the end. But no, they just turned it into every lame, boring Triple H match in the history of mankind. He's getting the heat on Duke. It's literally just him doing moves and flipping his hair back every so often. Meanwhile, you got Lawler sitting there on commentary sniffing Hunter's valet like an absolute creep. And the match just keeps going and going and going and going. Finally, Duke starts to rally a comeback. He hits a terribly sloppy-looking trash compactor for not the pinfall. No, instead, like an absolute dipshit babyface, he goes out to the floor and grabs his aluminum garbage can, throws the lid and the bottom into the ring, nearly decapitating Hunter when he chucked the lid over the top rope. Seriously, it came within like 2 inches of crushing Hunter's face. And so Duke teases he's about to level Hunter with the garbage can, but the ref intervenes and disposes of the bottom piece right as Hunter grabs the lid and then smashes it into Duke's face. Oh, this also occurred right in front of the referee. It did not lead to the automatic disqualification. So that is 2 back-to-back incompetent blown ref spots. And predictably, Hunter gets the pin. And this leads to what, you might ask? Well, of course. Naturally, this was all done to lead to WrestleMania next month, where Hunter evidently gets squashed by the returning Ultimate Warrior in 90 seconds. Because that makes logical sense. But don't you worry, all. WWF has got big plans for Hunter in 1996. Doing a job on the biggest show of the year in under 2 minutes to a washed-up ring veteran that got visibly blown up running down to the ring. Well, that just inherently screams, King of the Ring winner. No. We all know how that turned out. So now we turn our attention to some of the Camp Cornette drama. 2 weeks ago on Raw, Yokozuna was blamed for losing a very important tag match with Diesel and Shawn Michaels. And after Corny had castrated Yoko and poked the bear far too long, Yoko responded in turn by shoving Cornette to the ground and implementing his split from the group. So Yoko is now babyface. And not only is he babyface, but he's a walking, talking, pissed off babyface. And this is actually a very pivotal turning point in Yoko's career. For the very first time, now that he doesn't have a mouthpiece talking for him, Yokozuna conducted his very first solo interview where he was the one doing the promo. And I'll tell you what, man. Any remaining delusions from the WWF fan base that ever thought Yoko was actually Japanese, that was put to bed here. He sounded about as Japanese as me. Didn't even try talking with an accent. He was fully Samoan-speaking Yokozuna here. And it was actually a very good promo if you remove the obvious nature of the ethnic incongruity. He talked about for the last 3 years, he's let Cornette do the talking for him. He's given Cornette all the gold while Yoko never got any of the glory. And tonight is not just about revenge over Cornette. It's revenge on everybody in the faction. That includes Owen and Bulldog. And for Bulldog, he's wrong place, wrong time. Tonight, Yoko burns Camp Cornette to the ground. Bonsai. And, well, not to spoil what was to come, but if Hayes' closing comments were an omen to anything, when he finished off by saying, "Get ready for a train wreck," I said, "Don't you worry, Hayes. I am mentally prepared in more ways than one." And let me assure you, he was not lying. This was a train wreck and then some. Not that I was ever anticipating this match to be good on paper. When they announced it on Raw, I was like, Yoko versus Davey Boy. My God, does that sound absolutely appalling. They had what I can best describe as a very mediocre TV-style match with one of the lamest fucking afterbirths I think I've ever seen. Now, first of all, we've got to call a spade a spade. Yokozuna was beyond reproach by this stage of his career. God bless the guy. I liked Yokozuna when I was growing up. But you would have to be an absolute fool to go back and watch him during this period and say he was anywhere on the level he was back in 1993 or even parts of 94. Not only had he visibly doubled in size since we started these Raw reviews, but you just look at the way he was moving around the ring in this time. It legitimately made me sad watching it. He could barely do anything physically. I mean, he was gassed less than 2 minutes in. Bulldog's out there having to work overtime to try to compensate for this terrible match. I mean, it didn't go all that long, but it was not good for the 5 minutes it went. And I don't know what the hell was going on with this post-match, but something tells me they either went home early in the match or tried to stretch out a heat angle longer than necessary. Okay, so the match ends in a DQ when Cornette hits the ring and then smacks Yoko with a tennis racket. And right as Yoko's about to get his hands on Cornette, here comes Vader to hit the ring to get the jump on Yoko. So he and Bulldog trap Yoko in the corner and then handcuff him to the ropes. And they're over there just wailing on him for what had to have been a legitimate 5 minutes. It just went on and on forever. And I'm sitting there laughing because poor Leon, he's having a really hard time keeping his mask on. It just kept popping off his face during the beatdown. Like, eventually, I think he just said, fuck it, and kept brawling without the mask, realizing it wasn't worth fighting over. And, like, they got officials out there trying to break it up, but none of them are effective in actually stopping the fight. Finally, they managed to get Yoko down on the ground for long enough to where he can't retaliate. And then the segment just ended. I could not believe how fucking long this thing went on. Like, I'm half expecting somebody to come out to help, even if it's just a handful of underneath guys. But no, they did a full 5-minute sequence where the heels just kept going after Yoko. And then Yoko would occasionally fight back. The heels would cut him off again. Yoko would fight back another time. And they just lather, rinse, repeat this cycle until, again, it just basically ended. I'm like, Jesus, that was brutal. And I know this is all leading to this big multi-man match next month at WrestleMania. I don't even think Vince was stupid enough to actually book Yoko and Vader in a singles match on that card. That would have been the death knell on that show. But man, it's so hard to watch Yoko work around this time. His tail end of the WWF run. And the fact that he lived another 4 years after this was a fucking miracle. But this was easily the low light of the pay-per-view. No question. And I'm a huge Jim Cornette fan. Everybody knows that. I loved his work throughout the years and rarely ever had a bad thing to say about anything he was involved with. But going back and reliving some of this Camp Cornette stuff, there's some really rough patches to struggle through. It wasn't what a lot of people chalked it up to be. Okay, here's everything I wrote down about the next pre-tape. I'm just going to read what I wrote in my notes and I'm moving on. Goldust molests an innocent man while hyping a TV match with Razor tomorrow on Raw. Sounds about right. And that brings us to Owen Hart versus Shawn Michaels. With the added stipulation, for all the marbles, it's for the official WrestleMania #1 contender spot. And if Shawn loses, he does not get to fulfill his boyhood dream of capturing the WWF Championship at WrestleMania. Oh, the horror. He had a much greater chance of tearing his ACL during that entrance than doing a job to Owen in this match. And let's talk about that entrance for a minute. You want to talk about taking unnecessary risks right before the biggest show of the year? They got Shawn making this big dramatic entrance here. He's doing poses on top of the house set. They're setting off pyro and just giving him the whole shebang. And I'm wondering, because I legitimately forgot how all this went down. I'm like, how in the hell is he supposed to get off that roof? There's no ladder. Well, as it turns out, they end up dangling a giant rope from the ceiling so that Shawn could swing Paul Burchill style onto the rampway like a fucking pirate. And I'm watching as he's about to drop down from the rope. It had to have been a good 6 or 7 feet off the floor. I'm like, dude, that could have ended horribly if Shawn wasn't as athletic as he was. Why would you even attempt something like that? With the guy you're planning to have main event WrestleMania in a month for the title? That's some WCW level stupidity right there. So, believe it or not, of all things for me to remember about this pay-per-view, the biggest thing that still sticks in my craw, it was all this pre-match stuff once Shawn got into the ring. And I remember it because I was blown a gasket about the unprofessionalism of Shawn here. This just infuriated me to no end. So Shawn's dancing and prancing his way down the aisleway. He gets in the ring. And while they're still playing Shawn's music, he immediately shit cans Owen and dumps him out to the floor like an absolute geek. And of course, then he just blows it off and goes back to shaking his ass for the camera and removing his ring jacket. I'm like, do we really need to see that? It wasn't even cute in the sense of, oh, that's funny, Shawn getting to embarrass Owen a little before the match. He just made Owen look like such a dweeb. Like, keep in mind, he throws Owen out to the floor, and while he's in the ring doing his posing, Owen has to basically sit on the floor and sell for like another 2 minutes while Shawn's raw dogging for the camera. So it's not even like he did it and then they rang the bell 10 seconds later. They just wasted another 2 minutes of Shawn acting like a dick. Did I ever mention how insufferable Shawn was around this time? God, he had such go-away heat with me. More than anybody in the world up to that point. I'll be honest, there were not too many guys that had the wrong kind of heat with me as a kid. Shawn Michaels, man. Pre-2000 Shawn was right up there at the top of the list. I mean, I think the closest we've come to him since that point for me is probably Charlotte Flair. She'll have go-away heat with me until the day she retires. And it's really a shame that I even have to talk about all that stuff with Shawn. Because objectively speaking, this was a really good match. But between all the hot dogging with Shawn and Vince giving him a verbal anal probing throughout the entire segment, and it's so hard to be impartial a lot of the time. But the work was still really good here. Owen was just absolutely outstanding. He gave Shawn a belly-to-belly throw in this match that looked better than anything I've ever seen Kurt Angle do. And I will credit him where it's due. Shawn gave Owen a lot in this match. Probably because he knew he was going over and figured, well, I respect Owen enough to give him something. So Shawn sold for a good chunk of the match, trying to build that tension of him possibly losing his WrestleMania spot. And they eventually went to the well with that infamous concussion spot from late last year when Owen had given Shawn the heel kick to the back of the head. Eventually, Owen missed a charge in the corner. Shawn starts to fire back on Owen and hit most of his signature offense. They had a cool little sequence after Shawn had given Owen the elbow drop where he was setting up for the sweet chin, but Owen initially ducks it and tries for another heel kick. But then Shawn reversed that and then hit the sweet chin for the 3. You know, like I said, I don't want to totally diminish the work between both guys here because, well, that would be unfair. You know, this wasn't Shawn pulling a SummerSlam 96 with Vader and just blatantly acting like a horse's ass on live pay-per-view. No, he gave Owen plenty of shine, but in the end, we all knew who was going over, so it wasn't a surprise in the slightest. If you remove all the pre-match shenanigans, I would not have had any qualms with the segment. It was almost a damn near perfect match. But you know how it goes. Shawn's gonna Shawn. But we have our official #1 contender for the title in Mania. And now it's time to find out who the champion is going to be walking in. As if there was any real suspense. Main event. Cage match between Diesel and Bret Hart for the WWF Championship. Actually, before that, sorry, I jumped the gun. We got to talk about this Roddy Piper interview with Todd. As much as I would rather not have to watch anything involving Todd Pettingill. So if you watch the Raw review from, I guess it now would have been 3 weeks ago, they announced that Piper would be filling in as the interim WWF president while Gorilla Monsoon was recovering from the Vader attack on Raw the night after the Royal Rumble. It was a very odd, strange segment, as most Piper segments were in wrestling, which is why they were also simultaneously great. So he comes out for this interview, and he basically said very little while also using a lot of words and fabrication. First, he makes the announcement that Shawn is the number one contender for the WWF title at WrestleMania, which we already knew. Thanks, Roddy. And then he does a very roundabout promo on Yokozuna and Vader to announce that they are, in fact, going to be fighting one another at WrestleMania. So that was a memory slip on my part. Apparently, they were initially advertising that as a singles match. So thank God sanity prevailed and we didn't get that potential four-finger stinker. Could you have imagined? Oh, it should also be noted, during Piper's tirade, he made a jockstrap joke about Vader's mask, said he was wearing it on the wrong part of his anatomy. Goes without saying. And then eventually Cornette comes out to, as best he could, get a word in edgewise by jaw-jacking with Piper on the stick. And that did not go over as swimmingly as people might hope. He basically yelled at Piper and told him he used to wear a t-shirt that read, "No fear," indicating that he never feared anybody in the World Wrestling Federation. But there's one man that has struck fear in the hearts of everybody nationwide, and that man was Vader. So come WrestleMania 12, Yokozuna is going to find himself in deep water when he has to get inside the ring with a pissed-off, fired-up Vader. And then Piper made a comeback with comments about Yokozuna's ass cheeks. He basically implied that he was going to shove Jim's face into Yoko's asshole. And then Piper proceeded to grab Corny's Hershey Highway and give him a little up and down rub. That all happened, by the way. I'm not making that up. The only thing I said was, if only Goldust were around to see it live. It's probably where he got the inspiration to challenge Piper for Mania. He saw the segment and said, "Piper plays for my team. Let's get it on." God, the sexual innuendos on this program pre-Attitude Era. It's impeccable. So anyway, now we can talk about the cage match. God, what a waste of 5 minutes that interview was. Literally to set up a match that never even took place. So, if I go back and review the timeline of the Bret Hart-Diesel feud, you reflect back on the matches they've already previously had, where does the cage match rank among their series of bouts? I don't know. King of the Ring 94 was just okay. But you have to remember, they were essentially doing babyface versus babyface at that time. Got back when Diesel was still the champion. And the DQ finish was obviously designed to move the feud forward. And then you fast forward a year later, after they had massively detoured from Bret working main event feuds and mostly being relegated to mid-card status. Well, he finally wins the belt back from Diesel at Survivor Series. And that match was more or less remembered for Diesel turning heel as opposed to the actual quality of the work in the match. Although it was still arguably better than the 94 match. And then you get this cage match, which, it was nowhere close to the level of Bret and Owen from SummerSlam 95 in their cage match. Kind of goes without saying. On general principle, I've just never been a fan of the WWF style of cage matches. The whole escape the cage role never appealed to me. It just drags everything down a lot of the time because it ends up getting way too formulaic where somebody hits a big move, tries to escape through the door or over the top of the cage. They get cut off. It's just very square. It slows the pace of the match down. Although in this case, I think most of the blame can be put on the fact that it was a Kevin Nash match. I really didn't like this match all that much. It wasn't bad. It was just very unexciting. It fell into the trap of every WWF cage match where they trade back and forth, slowly trying to climb out of the cage when they had the advantage. Every so often you get a high spot from Bret or something to break up the monotony. I mean, for the amount of time they allotted to this thing, though, there was way too much downtime. And my God, was that finish so fucking stupid. Diesel's about to climb through the door, and you can even see throughout the show, they clearly had a trap door staged in the bottom left corner of the ring so they could do this spot. So it was very distracting throughout most of the pay-per-view. And then right before Diesel can get out of the cage, the Undertaker pops up from under the ring and then pulls Diesel down into the depths of hell. And I know what you're all thinking. Yes, that part was idiotic. But it wasn't even the dumbest part. The dumb part was the fact that the Undertaker had pulled Diesel under the ring before Bret had escaped the cage. Diesel's feet clearly touched the floor well before Bret. Now, granted, if we're getting into semantics, we never officially saw Diesel touch the ground. But, I mean, we're not all that stupid, right? Unless gravity completely shut off for that one moment in time. So yeah, Taker pulls Diesel down under the ring. They shoot off the fog machine and some weird, ominous red-colored lighting. And then Bret obviously climbs over the cage and wins. And then moments later, we see Diesel pop out of the hole. His pants are now ripped to shreds. And then we see Taker stalk Diesel over the top of the cage as the show basically fades to black. And the Undertaker interference wasn't all that startling. They've been alluding to this program ever since the Rumble pay-per-view. In storyline, it makes sense that Taker would screw Diesel out of the belt, since Diesel's responsible for fucking Taker over twice now, both on pay-per-view and Raw. But I just couldn't get over the booking here. You had Diesel get pulled down under the ring where he clearly would have touched the ground with both feet before Bret. Yet Bret is still declared the winner because hell apparently doesn't contain gravity. But it's official. We're getting Shawn and Bret for WrestleMania, baby. And then Diesel and Taker, or Diesel and Taker. Who gives a fuck? Does it really matter? But at least both of those matches are set in stone. Yeah, like I said, they pretty much established what the top matches were for Mania by the time the show was over. I think now it's just a matter of rounding out the card with all the prelim stuff. Again, I don't remember a whole lot of what I talked about with this pay-per-view when we did the casual review a couple years ago. When I look back at it, surprising as it might seem, I didn't hate the show. There were a couple good things on it. Razor and the Kid was good, even if the gimmick stipulation was kind of goofy. Shawn and Owen was great. Discount Shawn's pre-match tomfoolery. Main event I wasn't a big fan of. And the Yoko Bulldog segment was just perpetually long. But outside those two things, it was an easy watch. How long was the show? Overall runtime? About 2 hours? I mean, that is the net benefit of going back to watch these in-your-house pay-per-views. They're mostly 2 hours in overall runtime. So it's not like you're stuck to the TV monitor for 4 hours trying to sit through a bunch of infomercials and tediously long ring entrances. You know, if this were a WWE pay-per-view, this thing would have gone 6 fucking hours easily. 4 of those would have been nothing but entrances. Hey, listen, WWF sucked around this time. I make no bones about it. This was not a good time for the product. But at least it didn't suck for 4 to 6 hours. Now WWE sucks and the shows go on for 4 to 6 hours. They're just more popular right now and making boat tons of money on advertising, ticket sales, and merchandise. Even if the booking largely sucks. All right. And with that out of the way, we can move on with the following night's Raw. And yes, they actually aired one this week. I triple-checked. You know, before I get into anything else, can I just say, Tammy Sytch must have been having the time of her life around this period. Getting paid God only knows how many sums of money to literally just show up and shoot sexy cameos for 8-second Raw clips. It's a damn shame she can never keep her head screwed on straight. Like I just imagine somebody in the office telling her, Tammy, we need you to show up to the beach with a bathing suit and talk provocatively into the camera about liking it raw. We'll pay you $150,000 or whatever her salary was around this time. Might have been even more than that. If anybody can locate the details on Sonny's WWF contract in the late 90s, please share. If she wasn't among the top 5 most paid talents on that roster, I'd be shocked. Anybody that tells you women have it rough in society, you can let those people know I told them to lick the darkest, hairiest part of my asshole. You let me know the next time the average dude makes 6 figures on OF by literally showing off his body. It ain't happening. And we'll get into the meat of this week's show in a little bit. First, we got to talk about a match involving a guy who likes meat. It is a Royal Rumble rematch for the Intercontinental title between Goldust and Razor Ramon. Because after the first time we saw Goldust rub one out on Razor on live pay-per-view, you had to expect we'd see it again, right? You know, I don't know if this was around the time when Vince got the idea of rematching pay-per-view bouts on free television literally weeks after the people just paid premium price to watch it. But this is now the second straight time we've seen a title match on the 96 Rumble card that was just done again on television for free. A few weeks ago, it was Bret and Taker, and now it's Goldust and Razor. It might be coincidental, but if it is, that's a fucking wild coincidence. And now you just picture, fast forward 20 years later on Raw, imagine seeing Goldust versus Razor Ramon on Raw for 6 weeks in a row with no added stipulations. And they're practically the same exact matches with the same finish results. Vincent K. McMahon booking in a nutshell, people. God. I mean, to be honest with you, I really didn't even pay all that close attention to the match itself. Call me a skeptic. I've been watching this shit for nearly 30 years. The minute they rang the bell to start this thing, I pretty much figured it was going to be one of two results. Razor was either going over by countout or he was going over by DQ. Surprise, surprise, it ended up being the former. Now, there were some spots in this thing where I just watched and went, you know, people often sit there and talk about how banged up a lot of these guys from back in the day got by taking bumps. There's a spot in this match, I shit you not. This was almost mind-boggling when I saw it. Razor catches Goldust in the SOS position, and as he's casually holding Goldust in his arms, he's looking around the ring, and he starts slowly walking toward the ropes. And I'm like, no. There's no way. Sure enough, Razor just heaves Goldust overhead out to the floor in the SOS position. Goldust lands hard on the outside padding. And keep in mind, we're not talking about padding like with what you see today where the entire border of the ring is encased in black cushion. This was still back when they essentially had a small ring mat, like a quarter of an inch thick, over solid concrete. That was the only thing that braced Goldust landing, potentially preventing him from breaking his back. I was like, why would you even fucking do that? For a pointless TV match that ended in 8 minutes via countout? Fucking stupid. And yeah, sure enough, of all people to take that bump, Dustin Rhodes, and he's still wrestling today. Don't even know how that's humanly possible. So again, not to diminish anything these guys did here, but they're having just an okay back and forth match until Goldust decides, I've had enough. So he and Marlena bail and get themselves intentionally counted out. Exactly how I figured it would go down. And then Razor gets on the mic and says, exact quote, I wrote this down word for word just to let you know I'm not misinterpreting his promo. He goes, Goldust, I don't want your belt. I want your ass. Well, that about settles it. Confirmed. Razor Ramon was into dudes all along. Sometimes he's just never take into account the most unlikely of suspects. By the way, all kidding aside, the fact that Razor just outright told the people that he didn't give a crap about the Intercontinental belt, and that really is all you need to know about the state of where this championship was in the late 90s. The simple fact that Goldust has been the champion for well over a month now, he has worked 2 televised matches, both of which he's lost. So way to go, guys. Booking your mid-card champions like absolute dorks. Glad to know it's still a belt worth giving a fuck about. So after Razor blows all that off, he then turns his attention to, again I quote, Roddy Rowdy Piper, because Razor wasn't really following the product much around the early to mid-'80s. And, well, the long and short of it is, he wants Piper to book a match between Razor and Goldust for any time and anywhere. He says that Piper likes to flaunt his status by talking about his 6 kids or whatever. Well, Razor's got kids too. And he doesn't like the idea of them watching a television product where a grown adult man is going around trying to anally probe dudes. Okay, admittedly, he did not actually say that part out loud, but that was kind of the gist. So if Piper is the matchmaker, he can make a match between Goldust and Razor. He's actually the president, but I guess they're one and the same. He also did not directly say anything involving a street fight or a no DQ stipulation. That was sort of implied based on his delivery. You know, other than Razor admitting to wanting Goldust's ass, I thought the promo was fine. A little long-winded. And it was basically all for naught, considering we don't actually get the backlot brawl payoff between those two in Mania. Again, though, man, just going back to rewatch this Razor Goldust stuff from early 96, I understand a lot of passionate WWF fans will bend over backwards to try to defend this feud. Oh, it was so innovative and ahead of its time. I liked both of these guys as talents. I hated the Goldust gimmick, but I'm sorry. This whole thing was incredibly fucking stupid. And like the fact that Piper is now going to be the intermediary. Like, you know what match I would rather see instead? Based on what Razor was talking about in this promo, I'd have rather seen him and Piper in the backlot brawl. That would have been a hell of a lot of fun. But instead they're using Piper to further along this perpetual Goldust-Razor feud. And then moving on with things, after a brief Doc Hendricks In Your House pay-per-view recap, we head back to the ring for what I think was supposed to be a tag match with the Body Donnas versus Aldo Montoya and Barry Horowitz. But instead, Vader came out and beat the shit out of Montoya and Horowitz, which I'll admit was a much better substitute. I don't really know what the point of it was. Aside from Vader is big, mean, and ugly and likes to beat the shit out of people. It's kind of all there was to it. And then we had what was probably the big news bulletin of the week for Raw. And while he didn't actually make an appearance in person, we got a video package. And the only information we got about his soon-to-be return was that somehow Piper was responsible for the final decision. And when I say responsible, I mean he should have been held responsible for even suggesting such a repulsive idea. And if you know your 1996 history, there's only one name I'm referring to. We're talking about the return of the Ultimate Warrior. And there's obviously a lot to unpack when you go back and look at the Warriors' return to the WWF in 96. As short-lived as it was, which, I mean, that's another drama entirely. I'm not going to get super in the weeds about it, but I will say, you know, someone who didn't grow up watching the WWF product from the late 80s and the early 90s, it's hard to come off as unbiased when you're talking about the main draws and the big stars from around that period. Like, if you watch the WWF and you grew up an Ultimate Warrior fan, look, I get it. I was a Flair, Sting, Midnight Express, Dusty mark. Some of y'all were Hogan, Warrior, and Macho Man marks. Different strokes for different folks. I will never try and assert the claim that Warrior never drew money for the WWF or that he wasn't a big star during his prime. I mean, he was arguably the biggest star, even superseding Hogan at one point in time. You know, especially when you think about that 90 to 91 period. WrestleMania 6, Sky Dome in Toronto, Warrior's big night when he beat Hogan for the WWF Championship. Even though Hogan kicked out at like 2.99999, but it still went down in the record books as a defeat. And it was always so weird to me because over the years, I've gone back and watched a lot of Warrior footage from the early 90s. I think about his run as the champion when he was still white hot and super over with the fan base. You know, some of those matches he had with Kurt Hennig and Rick Rude and Sergeant Slaughter. You obviously think about the retirement match with him and Savage at the following year's WrestleMania, even though it wasn't a real retirement. And then, of course, you get into all the contract scandals with him and Vince in 91 over WrestleMania 7 royalty payouts. You know, the whole controversy where Vince suspended Warrior for no-showing SummerSlam that year. Warrior basically giving his notice shortly thereafter, which the WWF declined because I think Warrior was still under contract through sometime in 92, even though he had written his formal resignation sometime in the fall of 91. It was a massive laundry list of BS back and forth. Again, I'm not going to get bogged down with the details. You'll remember, though, there were initial plans to bring Warrior back in 92 and then give him another run with the belt. You'll have to excuse my ignorance. It's been a long time since I went back and thought about any of this stuff. Didn't he work with Savage again for the title, but didn't actually win it? Like, I think they were going to do something where he would turn heel and then win the belt after being aligned with Mr. Perfect. I don't remember how the whole thing was supposed to go down. Again, I wasn't really following the product all that religiously around that time. But the point I'm getting at is, I always found it so bizarre. He gets released sometime in 92, very unceremoniously, and then he's just gone for like 3 or 4 years. I think he may have worked indie dates in between, but nothing on a mainstream level for several years. And then he comes back here in 96. I can't really say with minimal fanfare. It was just, hey, the Warrior's coming back. Even though there's not really a incentive and people aren't really clamoring for it. There's no real explanation for it. He's back. And this was really where I was watching The Ultimate Warrior in real time as opposed to seeing tapes from him from previous years. And it's such a strange run. You know, but it's also not very juxtaposing to his work post-91. He's around for a little bit, and then shit goes down behind the scenes. And eventually he's just gone again. It happened in 92. It happened again here in 96. And he doesn't even make it until SummerSlam. I think he gets fired by like June or July. And then, of course, he shows up in WCW in 98, and well, that's a tragedy that's been recounted many times over the years. The only thing I need to do is mention the mirror, and everybody immediately shits their pants. That and voodoo magic trickery. I probably spend more time in the last 5 minutes talking about the Ultimate Warrior than we'll probably spend talking about his entire run here. He was there 1 minute and then poof. It was over. I never got the hype of Warrior. Again, I understand he was a big star. He made Vince a shit ton of money. God, his matches and promos were the absolute shits. And when you think back, you know, that was when Warrior was younger. You know, now we're 3 or 4 years later. He'd been out of the business full time. I don't know what they were expecting, but it wasn't looking all too promising. I'll say that. And then we had Marty Jannetty taking on Steve Austin. By the way, Bob Backlund is still campaigning. Just figured you'd like to know that. You know, actually, I just mentioned how Warrior was the only central talking point on this week's program. It's not entirely true. I guess we can also claim this episode another landmark moment in wrestling history. It was not the ringmaster we were getting here. They dropped that gimmick like yesterday's school lunch. And as Vince quoted here as Austin and DiBiase were making their ways to the ring, this was Steve Austin, a stone-cold individual. See what he did there? Foreshadowing. Not quite ready to call him Stone Cold Steve Austin yet. But the gears were turning. They were simmering on this idea very heavily. So yeah, Austin now has shaved his head completely bald. He's starting to grow out the facial hair. Got a little bit of swag to his walk. The Stone Cold gimmick is slowly becoming more part of his overall personality. And yeah, he's still carrying around the $1 Million Championship, and his music still sucks. But the foundation was there. And while people may have not seen it at the time, Austin would only become more of an on-screen presence. Oh, side note, we also heard from Vincent Lawler that the New Rockers are a formed tag team in the World Wrestling Federation. Who could forget about the New Rockers? Good old Marty Jannetty and Leif Cassidy. Poor Al Snow. It's just so weird going back and watching a Steve Austin match when the crowd did not give a fuck. Like, he and Jannetty are out there wrestling, and in the background, you got 1 million people walking around and just being totally disengaged. I mean, this was a piss break segment for most of the audience. And it was a totally different tune about 6 months later, brother. Didn't take long for the people to get engaged with Austin's segments. This, however, was not one of those segments. I don't blame them. They're out there having this painfully boring TV match. Crowd's getting deader and deader with each passing minute. Austin is just falling off at the hinges the longer it goes. I don't know what happened in the last few minutes, but he looked so horrible. He was running the ropes all funky, just not communicating spots with Jannetty at all. It totally fell apart. And eventually Austin locks in the sleeper hold and gets Jannetty to pass out. Still an awful finish. I have no idea why Austin was still using that hold by this point. I mean, yes, he technically knew how to apply it. Doesn't mean that it was a good finish. But man, oh man, Vince is already pounding the Stone Cold phrase down our throats. To the point where you're like, all right, dude, we get it. You're trying to get over Stone Cold Steve Austin. We see that. You know, again, they had the right idea with all this. It just wasn't quite fleshed out. But he's got a better look. Bald head, goatee. That's always going to supersede the short, blonde-haired, clean-cut look. That was never going to get over. We had a Mankind vignette from the dungeon where he was talking about God creating him on the 8th day. And, well, he wasn't all that particularly happy about it. I'm sure his pet rat wasn't particularly happy about being screamed at for 2 minutes straight. But it was a good, creepy promo package. It's Mick Foley, man. Guy always knew how to make the most out of anything he was given. Do love Do I need to say any more? And that led us to the TV main event of Tatanka versus The Undertaker. I don't know what's more incredible to me. The fact that the $1 Million Corporation is still a fucking thing, or the fact that Tatanka still had a contract at this time. Sorry, I'm just reading my notes here and remembering how stupid this came off on television. So Taker and Tatanka are having a match, and right before the commercial, Diesel walks out with, "I'm not kidding you," an axe. And I think it was just the way Vince sold it on commentary that had me laughing. Very matter of fact, he's just like, "It's Diesel with an axe." And like, you see Diesel making a beeline down the aisleway with his gimmick. You're like, is he going to hit the ring and try to drive this through Undertaker's skull? Well, no. Actually, he had other plans. Plans that involved, in this order, kidnapping an innocent cameraman, hauling him to the back, and then forcing him at will to film Diesel destroying Taker's coffin. By the way, a coffin that was just randomly sitting somewhere in the back of the arena. And let me assure you, as stupid as all of that sounds, it 1,000% beat having to watch Tatanka put The Undertaker in a headlock for 3 minutes. So this coffin demolition goes on for a very long time. And like, I mean, I know Taker's in the middle of working a match, but he doesn't ever take the time to look over his shoulder to be like, "Hey, that motherfucker's destroying my coffin." Nope. He's just out there doing wrestling moves with Tatanka. Meanwhile, Diesel's in the bowels of the building somewhere, fucking pounding away on the center of the earth with his axe. It eventually gets to a point where you can't even see anything that's going on, which is what made the whole thing comical. You just see this black screen while you hear loud banging in the background. And then he finishes at the precise moment that Taker gives Tatanka the tombstone for the win. At which point, they show a replay of Diesel destroying Taker's casket. And now that Taker's actually paying attention to the big screen, I guess they weren't actually showing the split screen on the Jumbotron while the match was still going on. And, well, I'll finish up the details on this groundbreaking axe murder in just a minute. First, I got to talk about Larry Fling. And for those of you asking, who in the blue fuck is Larry Fling? I actually had no idea until I looked it up. But since Vince was roped into pop culture around this time, yeah, I had to figure he was going to involve Billionaire Ted in something stupid. So Larry Fling was a terrible spinoff of the Larry King Live segments they used to air on CNN from like the late 80s through, I think, the early 2010s. I had to ask my dad because, I mean, we never watched CNN in my house growing up. In fact, we never listened to mainstream liberal news, period. And this was still back during a time where you could actually call CNN a moderately liberal news media outlet. Nowadays, it's just woke leftist propaganda. Even moderately well-educated liberals make fun of how stupid CNN is now. Such a joke of a network. And if you don't believe me, look at their fucking ratings. They're doing AEW Dynamite numbers these days. But anyway, I text him. I'm like, Dad, who the hell was Larry King? And he responded with, former radio host on CNN that used to interview big names and celebrities. Wore goofy suspenders. I think he actually interviewed Donald Trump back in like the early 90s. But I heard that and was like, so essentially every modern late night talk show host. But apparently he did banner ratings for them once upon a time, so fuck me, right? I guess he got replaced by Piers Morgan. Lord knows, if you're getting replaced by Piers Morgan of all people, something's wrong with your show. In any case, the whole thing's one giant insider gag. They had call-ins from Randy and Terry. Made fun of Randy and said, caller must be from Atlanta. Even though they literally had a screen cap that read, Sarasota. So that joke fell flat on its face. And then Terry, a.k.a. the Huckster, well, he called in to ask Ted for Monday night off because he got struck in the head with a lady's high heel shoe. Again, a little bit of insider comedy for you. And then, Larry proceeded to run Ted up a flagpole about all the legal scandals and stock fraud that was happening behind the scenes with the Turner Network. And after Ted pretended to have laryngitis to avoid having to answer the questions, Larry pitched next week's show where he'd interview the Nacho Man and the Huckster about their geriatric WrestleMania encounter. So we have that to look forward to. By the way, I'm not making any of that up. That was just the Cliff's Notes summary. Lord knows I had the patience to actually dive into the details of all this bullshattery. And that left just enough time in the show for The Undertaker and Paul Bearer to see their now dilapidated casket remains. It was basically Paul just breaking down into hysterics while Taker stood there emotionless. Because, Taker really didn't have any emotion. And, well, that was quite riveting. Glad to see that needed its own follow-up segment. So much of the show baffles me sometimes. It's like, we have an hour of programming, yet we somehow never have enough content to fill that block. So large chunks of the show are just random pre-tapes or merchandise plugs or bad billionaire Ted skits. Then you get your occasional piss break squash match. Or you just put Sonny out there in a bra for 30 seconds. Now, this show didn't have that much filler, but if I actually tried to be serious with these reviews, I think I'd lose my goddamn mind. People are like, oh, you exaggerate too much, or you're not taking the show seriously. All right, smart Alec. What the fuck do you want me to say about Tatanka versus The Undertaker? Who could possibly care? I love Taker, but God, dude. We're still talking about Tatanka in 1996? And the ship sailed on that experiment after the Luger flop in 94. Meanwhile, we're 24 hours removed from In Your House. Like 80% of the top stars are just not even on the show. Barely mentioned. No Shawn, no Bret, no Camp Cornette. You had Vader out there for all of 90 seconds. Diesel showed up with an axe and then walked right to the back again. You basically had Razor and Taker. That was about it. And before you know it, we're not even going to have Razor around. Now, that's kind of where we're at with 1996 right now. WrestleMania 12 is just around the corner, and man, is the build colder than a witch's tit right now. We'll see if things shape up. I actually don't remember WrestleMania 12 being that bad of a pay-per-view. I haven't seen it in years, but it certainly won't be as bad as WrestleMania 11. Good Lord. But we'll continue that journey, and hopefully you guys take the ride with me. Thanks, everybody, for checking out this week's show. Again, make sure you subscribe, comment, like for me. You can find us on either YouTube or Rumble. And we'll be back this Friday show for, I guess, normally scheduled programming. We'll get back into the studio wrestling talk with WCW and more Mid-South and world-class coverage. Hope to see you there. Take care, all. Peace out.